Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining.
So we've been admitting people at this point who had signed up that they wanted to speak, and I just wanted to give you, if you had any questions about the format before we open it up and let everybody in. I hope that the email I sent kind of explained how we're going to try to arrange this tonight, given the number of people that are willing to participate in this exercise.
Oh, I guess I didn't get the email. Maybe I can find it.
I would like to ask for a reminder about how long you expect our presentations to be.
As I indicated in the email, they're going to have to be in the 3 to 5 minute range if we're going to get through everybody.
Okay.
And we do want to have time for people to be able to offer comments about your presentation. I will give you a warning when there's when you're at 4 minutes. And I'm probably going to really have to cut people off, or else we won't be able to get through to everyone.
Right.
I don't know what's causing the little ringing noise. It's something new to me.
I think that means someone's joining.
Okay, we're about ready to open the floodgates.
Okay.
So Ira, when I do, I assume you'll welcome them and explain that we can wait a couple minutes before everyone joins and then get rolling.
Yep. Yes.
Here we go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our 2-session speaker training. As we talked about last time, we've had a much larger participation than we were expecting, which is a good problem to have. It's created a few challenges in terms of how we do how we format this. There are about 10 to 12 people who've indicated that they are ready to go ahead and do a presentation tonight, which is terrific. And the format we're going to have in a few minutes when we get started, we're going to have each of the presenters in turn talk for about 3 to 5 minutes, do their presentation, and then I'm going to ask one of the frequently asked questions that's applicable to the talk that they've given and give them a chance to respond to that. And then we're going to open the floor for just a few minutes for people to offer comments, constructive comments about what was good about the presentation, what they thought could be improved. And this is all meant, as an exercise to help us all learn how to do this better. So we are going to be operating under very tight time constraints. I've already told the speakers they get just 3 to 5 minutes, and I will cut them off at 5 minutes, or else we won't get to everyone. If you have comments to make, please make them, but please think them out in advance if you can, and make them concise and to the point. We don't have time for people to kind of ramble around. So let us get started. I had asked that people organize their comments around one of the 3 topics that I thought were sort of key to our message, and many of the presentations will be around that. Some are going to be on other aspects of the anti-nuclear question, and I think that's fine too, because as I said last time, what's really important is that the talk you give be one that talks to the issues that you're concerned about and that you feel comfortable with. So the first person on my list to speak is Yael Danieli, and I'm not sure that I see her here.
She's here.
Ah, good. Okay. So why don't we get started with Yael?
Okay. Are you unmuting me?
You are unmuted. We can hear you very well.
Okay. I'm Dr. Yael Danieli. I'm a psychologist, traumatologist, and victimologist who built the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children in the 1970s, worked with victims, survivors of other genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, and most recently founded the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. It is in those capacities that today I invite you to join me in imagining a to imagine experiencing and understanding what it is like to live with massive dread and annihilation, anxiety, inaction, and guilt in the face of lurking, threatening existential danger that we know about, but nonetheless find too terrifying to contemplate. The danger I'm referring to is of the current easy possibility of the end of life as we humans have known it by nuclear means. That is not just the abrupt end of a career, a job, a good life, an expectable routine, a marriage, a species, a beloved plant or forest or season, each of our own demise, or worse, the death of a loved one, especially your child. No, I'm speaking about the easy, abrupt possibility of the end of the entire life as we humans have known it by nuclear means, by pressing a nuclear button. In the field of stress and trauma, we speak of fight or flight as normative responses to threat, including perhaps feigning death. But those assume a threat or an enemy that you can sense, fight or attempt to flee. In the absence of that, reactions to uncontainable dread may take the form of chaotic, aimless action or frozen inaction, paralysis of body of mind and mind, or psychic numbing. Many attempt to insulate that state and continue, quotes, life as normal, with whatever part of their personhood and life they can, while maintaining the difficult knowledge and the dread at as low a level as possible. While this life might seem full of activity, essentially the main being is inactive. Only infrequently does despair seep through the cracks, but, quotes, life must go on. This is often accompanied with wordless sorrow and aimlessness and a vague sense of guilt. The definition of hope that emerged in my studies of the psychology and phenomenology of hope was that hope is the consciousness of optionality. That is, even in the midst of despair, there must be an option, even if I don't see it. I come from a thought tradition that holds that knowledge, painful and terrifying as it might be, is ultimately liberating. Also, that knowledge is responsibility, and that there are consequences to not realizing or acting upon that responsibility. This tradition also teaches, he who saves a single life saves the world entire. Consequently, conversely, if you don't save a life when you can, that is, choose inactivity, or you harm one life, you harm the entire world. Thus, each life embeds and is embedded in the whole creation. When we do own the difficult knowledge of humanity's nuclear potential, we are responsible to act on behalf of life and the world entire, if only to fulfill the rights of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Yael, and under 5 minutes, great talk. The frequently asked question that I think would come up perhaps from an audience hearing yours is, you've talked to us about hope, but how is it that we can convince people on the other side to join us in this endeavor that you're proposing? What about the Russians?
They are human beings too. They exactly experience everything I described at the beginning. They too do the best to run away from this knowledge. and they too do their best to pretend that nuclear weapons are just any other weapons, just bigger and stronger. They also flee away from knowledge. So I will talk with them, I will engage them, as we said last time, in trying to understand how they manage to flee the knowledge, how they manage to keep themselves away from their sense of responsibility to life, to nature, to life as they know it, and to future generations.
Great, thank you very much. That's a great answer. We got a couple of minutes. Do people have comments about Yael's presentation? And I think I can't see everybody because we've got so many people on the thing. If you could type in the chat just the word stack, I'll know to call on you, and then we can have people do things that way. Well, what I would say is my comment. I thought it was extremely well presented. It was very well organized. There was a clear thought about what you were trying to tell people. And you got to the point and conveyed a message. And that is really, sort of a key to doing a good presentation that reaches people, sort of knowing what it is that you want to tell them and what you want them to take away from it. Other comments? Kathy Malley, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I loved the poetry and the emotion, the wording of it. I missed the first minute, I'm sorry, but it really moved me deeply, and I thank you. And I think we need that kind of appeal as well, one that really does reach to our hearts. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
So there are a couple of comments that are in the chat. It was a beautiful, highly credible presentation. I wondered about reaching a young audience, young adults. And second comment, what can people who hear this powerful presentation do? What actions or ideas can we give them? And that was not really meant to be part of this presentation, Candace, but it is the right question. And that's some of the other speakers will be talking to that part of our message. Okay, let's move on then to the next speaker. That would be Elliot Adams.
I don't want to take your time to explain the horrors of even a limited nuclear exchange. If even a tiny portion of the existing nuclear weapons were exploded for whatever reason, the Earth will become uninhabitable. We choose to depend for our very survival that all the leaders of all the nuclear powers will be responsible, be reasonable, be rational, and be more concerned about the general population's well-being than about their own ego or their own well-being. Our willingness to depend on that is just irrational. Just think of the current and past leaders of North Korea, Russia, England, Israel, India, Pakistan, France, Germany, and the US, etc. Any one of them could intentionally, accidentally, or even unwillingly start a nuclear war. Yes, it should keep you awake at night. And that does not consider the even higher risk that an accident, that a mistake, that a lone wolf or some natural disaster could precipitate an exchange. Think about it. If you were like me, I make mistakes, drop things, cause accidents many times during a day. Thank God I'm not able to start a nuclear war. We would expect that all nuclear nations would have a fail-safe system to avoid an accidental nuclear exchange. But on the contrary, they have all set up the opposite. Fail-safe in the wrong direction. A system that guarantees no matter what happens, nuclear weapons can be launched. We can see that the world leaders have not reduced the risk of nuclear war. In fact, they keep increasing it. A case in point, the US is now shipping the very newest nuclear bombs, the B-62-12s, to Europe. These weapons both reduce the decision-making time and opens the door to more usable tactical nukes. This is the last thing we should be doing. Just owning nukes, we inspire proliferation. With the US practicing and threatening to invade North Korea, Kim Jong-un said he needed nuclear capability because no nuclear nation has ever been invaded. Kim Jong-un also said he learned a simple lesson. The US talked Gaddafi out of his nuclear program and then killed him miserably. We can easily and safely denuclearize the world, but history shows us it will never be done by the military. It will never be done by the leaders. It will only happen when we, the public, force them to do it. And to quote one of the great US philosophers, Frederick Douglass, the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those they oppress. Thank you.
Great talk. Let me pose you the question that I think would come up. You've talked about the danger of nuclear war, but we've had nuclear weapons for more than 70 years. They haven't been used. Haven't they kept the peace?
That's a great question. But actually, it isn't true. The fact is that nuclear weapons are not a useful weapon for the very reason we've already described, which is that if you start a war, you're going to mutually destroy destruction. The thing that will keep us safe is if we get rid of nuclear weapons, and that can be done safely.
Good answer and very concise. Comments or questions that people would like to make about that presentation? And again, just put your name in the chat and we'll call on you so you can speak. Cheryl, go ahead, please.
Yes, Elliot. Can you tell us a little more about these B-62 somethings that are being sent to Germany? How strong are they? What is the correct numbering of them? What kind of megaton capacity do they have?
So they are a dodge of the treaties we have. They are taking an old dumb bomb and making it into a smart bomb. So they've rehoused it. As far as capacity, one of the things that's dangerous about them is that they can carry very small nuclear payloads or very large nuclear payloads. One of the things that makes them dangerous is they can be dropped from a high altitude and then directed great distance so they can be used kind of like a missile in effect. The number of the B-62-12, they are the 12th generation of the B-62 bomb, but by keeping the old number and working with the old one, they can dodge around the treaties. Does that answer your question?
Good. Next person on stack is Lauren Peters. Go ahead, Lauren.
I'm sorry, I thought you guys would unmute me. My mistake. Elliot, it was your voice was very expressive, very emphatic. I enjoyed listening. Thank you.
Great. Other comments? Well, I would just second that. I thought that was a great presentation. Very clear, very compelling. Let's move on to the next person, which I believe is Lori Veach.
I'm challenged by technology, so I'll do my best. Let's see. Do I need to say share screen?
Lori, did you need to share screen?
I don't.
Okay, you're on. We can see you and we can hear you, so go ahead.
Will you be able to see the PowerPoint? How do I do that?
For that, you have to go to the bottom where it says share screen
I have
and
to,
click on that.
Can you
I have
see
to give,
that?
I have to give you the permission.
Okay, hold on just 1 second, Lori.
Now I can't see anybody. I can just see my slide. So I'll go ahead if you can see it. I'm Lori Beach. My topic is we are going to have a nuclear war if we do not change course.
Lori, excuse me 1
thank
second. Your screen hasn't shared. So if you're going to be relying on the slides, we can't see them yet. Did you press the little on the little icon that says share screen down at the bottom?
Share screen. Okay, let me try again. Yeah, this is the first time I've tried to use PowerPoint. So I click on share screen and see it.
Here we go. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, you're all set. Start.
Okay. All right. So now let me try going back. Okay. I'm speaking on we are going to have a nuclear war if we do not change direction, if we do not change course. 77 years ago, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima and 3 days later on Nagasaki. It has been 77 years since those bombs were dropped. And during that time, the number of nuclear warheads has dramatically increased. There are now over 13,000 warheads in 9 nations. Nuclear war could start on purpose or by accident. During the Cold War, many of us were very concerned that there could be a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And recently, Russia has made threats about using nuclear weapons in connection with their invasion of Ukraine. And certainly nuclear weapons used by Russia or the United States would be catastrophic for the world. But even a more so-called limited nuclear war would have terrible consequences for life on Earth. For instance, nuclear war between India and Pakistan was modeled in 2019 by climate scientists. They estimated 250 nuclear weapons, which would result in 50 to 125 million dead people quickly. Hiroshima produced 140,000 dead quickly. So this limited nuclear war would put tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, resulting in drops in global temperature, 6 to 9 degrees worldwide, and much more on the Eurasian and North American continents. This would result in major declines in food crops. Leading to will increasingly produce flashpoints and tensions among peoples. India and Pakistan have between them a large river, the Indus River, which is fed by glaciers in the Himalayan mountains. With climate change, these glaciers are disappearing, and the Indus River will become less and less, which will make people in Pakistan and India increasingly desperate for water. And these 2 nations have nuclear weapons. A nuclear war may start on purpose, it may start by accident. We know of 6 times where we narrowly avoided worldwide nuclear use by the United States or Russia. These are the dates of the 6 times when we almost had nuclear war by accident. It's only by luck that we didn't have nuclear war any of those 6 times. We can't keep depending on luck. This is not the future that must be, but it is the future that will be if we do not act. On August 6, 2022, some of us will remember Hiroshima 77 years ago. 77 years from now, will there be humans to remember Boston, to remember Burlington? Our lives, the lives of our children and all kids depend on whether we change course. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Very good. Right on time. We had a little bit of technical issue. Your voice was kind of soft, especially in the second half, but I hope everyone was able to hear that very solid presentation. The question I would ask is the one that I posed a minute ago to Elliot. You've talked about the dangers of war, either by design or by accident, but haven't nuclear weapons kept us from having a third world war since 1945?
Well, first of all, by accident. It's only by luck we haven't had a war by accident, and that keeps being the case if we keep playing Russian roulette with these weapons being available and on hair trigger alert. They're keeping more weapons, and they keep being easier. The time available to decide whether to launch them keeps getting shorter. So a war by accident it is going to happen sooner or later if we don't get rid of all these weapons.
Great. Solid answer. What comments do people have that they would like to offer on Laurie's presentation? And again, I would say, I think it was a compelling presentation that really made the case that you set out to make. You had a clear message you wanted to deliver, that war can happen, and by anyone of several mechanisms, and that was very clearly presented. Sue Enton, go ahead, please.
I thought it was a great presentation, but I would add to your response, which was very good, but wasn't, there was other things you could have said to that question. Not just that we've been spared 6 or more times nuclear war by accident. It hasn't deterred ground wars in which genocidal weapons and policies were carried out. It didn't stop us. It didn't stop the post-Soviet Russia in Syria, and it's just going to be there to be escalated.
Thanks for that comment, Sue.
Okay, sorry.
That's fine. Bernard Gordon?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for bringing in the India-Pakistan incident. You know, when that happened, the seriousness of that situation would have gone well beyond India and Pakistan, both of the drift of the winds and everything. And that's just a small splinter of what can happen out of this war now with Ukraine. Thank you for bringing that up.
And thanks for that comment. Okay, let's move on to the next speaker. And I have Todd Pierce next on the list. Todd, are you with us?
I am.
Go ahead, please.
I apologize. I don't have quite as polished a presentation as these others, but I'll go with what I have. Just bear with me 1 second, please. I'm sorry. Look at something else. So let me begin by saying that Hannah Arendt said in regard to war, we must see ourselves as others do. When one does that, one can begin to understand causation, which are the events which can lead to nuclear war, which means looking at nuclear war from its endpoint of the weapons involved may cause us to lose sight of what can be the cause of nuclear war, which we don't want to leave to future historians to understand, if there are any, after a potential nuclear war. So a quick definition of causation. It's the influence by which one event, a cause, contributes to the production of another event, an effect, where the cause is partly responsible for the effect, and the effect is partly dependent on the cause. In general, a process has many causes, which are also said to be causal factors for it, and all lie in its past. An effect can in turn be a cause of or causal factor for many other effects, which all lie in its future. Consequently, understanding the past is necessary and essential if we want to hope to avoid a nuclear war. Clausewitz, regardless of what your impression of him may have been from hearing of his name in the past, has been called the original phenomenologist. Phenomenologist of war is what what Peter Parrett, a Clausewitzian scholar, has written, a proto-Husserlian, who is the teacher of Hannah Arendt. And the point is that Clausewitz understand, and I'll just read a couple of things. The point of war is to impose our will on the enemy. That's the object of war. If one side uses force without compunction, undeterred by the bloodshed involves, while the other side refrains, the first will gain the upper hand. That side will force the other to follow suit. Each will drive its opponent toward extremes, and the only limiting factors are the counterpoises inherent in war. Here, importantly, is two different motives make men fight one another: hostile feelings and hostile intentions. Even the most civilized of peoples, Clausewitz wrote, in short, can be fired with passionate hatred for each other. Consequently, the idea that we should be continuously inciting the emotions of hatred against the Russians is counterproductive if we wish to avoid a nuclear war. Clausewitz went on to write, if war is an act of force, the emotions cannot fail to be involved. War may not spring from them, but they will still affect it to some degree, and the extent to which they do so will depend on the level of civilization, but on how, not on the level of civilization, but on how important the conflicting interests are and how long their conflict lasts. With that, I'm going to wing it a bit and just explain a little bit of not too recent, or rather recent history, going back to 1990, when the Cold War ended. At that time, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and a couple of other people involved wrote what was known as the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992. It can be found online. It was leaked because it was so horrendous. It declared that the United States henceforth would rule the world militarily. In later 1990s, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote of the geopolitical war that the United States must wage to gain control of Eurasia. Eurasia is a land that Russia and China are located on. And make no mistake, when we demonize Russia, we're avoiding the question that this war against Russia, this geopolitical war against Russia, as Richard Falk has called it just recently, also always involves China and Iran. That has always been U.S. military policy. I'm a retired Army officer. I spend a lot of time studying U.S. military policy and doctrine. I'm a Guantanamo. Is that it?
No, 1 minute.
Yeah. And I spent a lot of time as a Guantanamo defense attorney trying to understand how the U.S. government and the U.S. military could turn so totalitarian in its outlook. As a U.S. Army officer, I once had a document cross my desk saying that our policy was that we would not tolerate any other country to even have the potential influence to cause us to hesitate in our decision-making. That is how totalitarian our view of the world is. And going back to what Clausewitz wrote, war is reciprocal. We could not expect to have such a totalitarian ideology controlling our view of the world without expecting other countries to take reciprocal actions back. That's what we're up against now. If you look a little bit at the prehistory before February 24th of what was taking place in Ukraine, going back to 2014, our military leaders don't even hesitate to point out how the U.S. is involved in training Ukrainian forces. Yep.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I guess the question I would ask is, how is it that you propose from that analysis what is it that you propose we do to prevent nuclear war?
number
Excuse me, to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Number one, we need to look at ourselves. We've got the conventional weapons now, and Russians know it, Russian intelligence, Chinese intelligence know it, to totally annihilate both Russia and China. We don't need nuclear weapons to annihilate them. They become what they are as defensive weapons against such a force. And that's why we're never going to get rid of nuclear weapons as long as we pose such a threat to other countries, like to include Iran and North Korea. So the weapons themselves have become sort of a red herring because it's our conventional weapons. And I've studied US weapons, conventional weapons and nuclear. We got to reduce the hostile feelings and intentions we have toward the world if we want to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Thanks for that very clear answer. Comments, questions people have about this as a presentation? Cheryl?
Yes, I appreciate your background, Todd, and it would be very helpful if associated with your presentation, you could give us some references to some articles that you've written or other people have written about this issue of the US military policy and what those people 10 years ago said. And so that would be helpful to us. Well, both I think to the people listening and to me as part of my effort to talk to people, to have access to these reports you're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment, Cheryl. Bernard. Bernard Gordon, you're on stack.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for connecting it to China, particularly with the tension between China and Taiwan right now, which would definitely bring the US and Russia into it and make the world situation even more explosive. Thank you very much.
And Lauren Peters.
I would, I'm curious as to how that intersects the military state of mind intersects with our corporate empire, which I see as driving a lot of our behavior. That's sort of the other hand. The two, the military and the empire, go hand in hand and reinforce each other. Maybe that could be pointed out or developed. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on. Thanks very much for that presentation, Todd. Let's move on to the next one. I have Megan Whitney next on my list. Megan, are you with us?
Looks like no.
Okay. Then next would be Roger Weinreich. Roger, are you here with us?
Yeah, Roger is.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm in the middle of an electrical storm in a little crazy place, so I'll do my best. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so everyone, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk and read a little because I just put this together. It's really easy to understand how we might miss seeing the biggest and most immediate threat in our lives. The likelihood that a global nuclear war will end all life on Earth is increasing daily, and whether this event happens intentionally or by accident, or through human or computer error, we will have essentially committed mass suicide and died by our own hand. This fact alone is enough to make many of us believe that there is nothing that can be done to prevent it. But quite the opposite is true. And it is up to all of us to muster up the courage to make sure that a nuclear war never happens. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. So that's my favorite quote from John F. Kennedy. The nature of personal or collective suicide is that it is often very covert. There may or may not be warning signs that lead us down this path. Some people may endure a period of personal anguish or contemplation before taking their own life. For others, it happens in a flash. What scares me most about our present situation is that most people are oblivious to the self-imposed threat of nuclear annihilation that now looms before us. Please take a moment and follow with me on this crazy and not so crazy analogy. Picture this. There are some strangers who have just arrived in our town, lots of them. They have appeared out of thin air and all speak very different languages. We have no idea who they are. And now imagine that each of these strangers is walking directly behind each one of our children, and each stranger has a loaded gun pointed directly at the back of our child's small head. If our children were all walking around with guns pointed at their heads, we would not allow it. We would intervene right away. We would call the police and our neighbors, and we'd stop the madness. In reality, This is what is going on right now. The guns, of course, are not guns at all, but rather they are large nuclear missiles hidden underground or beneath the surface of the ocean. And they are far more dangerous than guns. We just can't see them, but they are still pointed at our children. The prevention of nuclear war needs to come up a notch or two on our priority list right now. Eliminating our planet's steady death march towards global warming, along with finding ways to mitigate the growing occurrence of mass shootings in our country, are super critical issues to deal with. We are growing educated about what can be done. We are sharing our views with one another about both of these topics, and we are making progress. However, when it comes to the subject of nuclear war, we are complacent and uneducated. Our heads are buried in the sand, and we don't even know how bad things really are. 9 people, meaning the leaders of 9 nations, control more than 13,000 nuclear warheads. Do you trust them all with your life and with the lives of your children? In the United States, the decision to launch our missiles rests with one man. In the event of an attack on the US, our president has only 10 minutes to verify that the attack is real and to launch our missiles in response. The decision to end all life on the planet should be more thoughtful and time-consuming than that. Science estimate that if only 300 to 500 weapons are exploded, the world will be plunged in what is called nuclear darkness, winter. The millions who die in the initial blasts will be considered the lucky ones. For the remaining inhabitants, dark clouds of debris will blot out the sun. Everything will be contaminated with radiation. Food and water will no longer be available, and everything and everyone will die during the ensuing year. I hope then that the time has finally arrived where we are ready to live without that loaded gun pointing at our heads, especially when there is a way to remove it. Let's begin to talk about this and educate ourselves about the action steps towards global nuclear disarmament. The United Nations recently enacted the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. They started working on this in 1947, so it was a long endeavor. Now 65 countries have signed on, and momentum is growing throughout the world to eliminate the threat of nuclear war. It's time to begin a serious discourse now with our families, friends, and neighbors. We need to become as knowledgeable and educated about preventing nuclear war as we are about preventing global warming. If we are ultimately to abolish nuclear weapons, but choose to keep conventional weapons as part of our existence, then at least we'll have ended mankind's ability to kill everyone on the planet by pushing a button. Thanks for listening, and let's do it.
Great presentation, Roger. Thanks for that. The question that I think you might have listed from somebody in the audience, a skeptic in the audience, is this. That was a very powerful presentation. How do we work in a world, though, where a message like that can't be brought to people, say, in Russia, where you can get sent to jail for calling what's happening in Ukraine a war?
Right, good question. I think the ultimate answer is we're going to just have to permeate all the strata and fabric of our communication networks with one another. So you're right, Russia may not listen to this right away. People in certain parts of the world won't even hear it, but it's time for us to start talking to our neighbors, and that's the start point, just getting a conversation going.
Very solid answer. Comments, questions that people have from about this presentation? I saw in the chat something that I would underline, which is love the analogy, that sort of thought exercise with somebody walking behind our children with guns pointed at their heads. Very effective, I thought.
Roger, it was extremely effective, and I thought part of why it is, you connected it to so many other dimensions of life and of danger and of the state of mind in this country. And I really like that very much, including the relationship to weapons. And that is really moved me. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And just as an aside, my background has been in weapons and weapon systems, and I've been really working to find ways to communicate beyond or away from that, because most people don't care about that right now. So thanks for that comment, because I am looking for ways to connect with other topics.
Other comments or questions for Roger? Okay, great talk. Let's move on to the next one. Next person I have on my list is Sue Enton.
I chose to discuss the moral question through the eyes of religious people. My apologies for not including Martin Luther King and William Sloane Coffin, but here is my essay. A Trappist monk of note In 1962, a man named Thomas Merton stated the entire human race could be wiped out by nuclear weapons. The United States and its opponent at the time, our Soviet Union, were committed to genocide, he said, by committing to the use of nuclear arms and either to defend themselves or to use them in first strike. Or they plan a second strike, both of them. This is what would happen even if the first one struck was pretty much wiped out for anything else. He quoted Pope John the 23rd as calling for peace and struggling for it non-violently. The philosophies of both sides of this Cold War seem to be totally materialist in different forms. And they were creating moral passivity in the face of technological proliferation of weapons. This moral underdevelopment led governments to make plans in which they wrote off hundreds of thousands or millions of casualties would be acceptable. I can't see how anybody would say that it was acceptable. The calculated use of nuclear weapons as a political threat is almost certain to lead eventually to a hot war, Merton said. And he added the free choice of global suicide made in desperation by the world's leaders and ratified by the consent and cooperation of all their citizens would be a moral evil second only to the crucifixion. He argues the necessity to protest and eradicate these weapons and all war. Joan DeFore, a former social studies teacher, now at the Unitarian Universalist office at the UN, reported that Pope Francis was early and completely involved in the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which was voted on in the UN. And as it happened in July 7th of 2017, March and June, the Pope Francis was trying to bring people into the agreement. Francis' stated purpose was to encourage discussion of the moral basis for nuclear disarmament. He challenged the idea of nuclear deterrence, which did not create peace. The TPNW, as of January 22nd, 2021, has been entered into force. And many people regret that the nuclear weapon holding countries are not party to this agreement. But we must keep it up. The idea of calculating how to bring the whole world to get rid of all their nuclear weapons before they get rid of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. I think the question that I would probably think that the audience might toss at you is something along the lines of, that's all well and good, but what can I do here in my community to make a difference about that?
Here, you can join a group that is like doing civil disobedience. You can join a group that's doing lobbying at the city, state, and federal level. You can make allies of different groups. You can talk to your school departments and see if there's any way they could put something in the curriculum of the science department about just talking about what was really going on with nuclear weapons.
Hey, good answer. Thank you. Comments on Sue's presentation or questions for her? And I see actually in the chat, many of the suggestions you just offered were people were offering as you were speaking. So your thinking is in parallel with the rest of the group here.
Well, that's good.
Are there other comments that people would make about Sue's presentation? Okay, let's move on to the next person then. I have Patricia Murphy next on the list.
I'd like to say that I thought we were supposed to be envisioning an actual presentation. So I was thinking about meeting with my students. I teach moral philosophy and looking at the existence of nuclear weapons as a particular instance where we could apply a few moral theories to determine the immorality of nuclear weapons. So my presentation is not going to be as perhaps as
just go ahead and do it. Make your presentation.
Okay. When we think about how we make decisions about morality, there are basically three approaches that we as human beings usually look to, whether we know it or not. One is to focus on the intention of what is being done. That is, we assess the intentions and usually give that evaluation to the act in question. Or we sometimes take what is called a deontological act proper approach, which is to assess the act itself and evaluate the act apart from considerations of intentionality or consequences, and feel that the more complex act is really deserving of that assessment. Lastly, and probably most commonly, we think of the consequences of actions and assess the outcomes or consequences of certain acts and bestow that evaluation on the act in question. So these are three basic tools we can employ to talk about if something is ethical or unethical, moral or immoral. But consider this way of thinking about nuclear weapons. When we ask, what are we intending to do? Sometimes the answer is defend ourselves. This goes back to the entire legacy of the Cold War and the 1980s and the development of so many weapons with an interest that they would keep us from using them. I remember back in the 80s, Caspar Weinberger was very famous for saying, they have kept the peace. The having of nuclear weapons, the continual buildup of nuclear weapons have maintained the peace. That can be one thing we think we are intending to do. Or we can just understand that we are trying to and intending to destroy all life forms, environment, earth, air, water, inanimate objects. This is what we call omnicide, the death to all that there is. Again, if we look at the act itself, considering nuclear weapons, we divert enormous amounts of money and resources to threaten or destroy others that could be used for human good. In addition to that, we create a model for other countries to increase or to be able to build weapons. That is, we invite very expensive competition. In other words, we give a blueprint for what ought to be done by virtue of our possession of nuclear weapons, maintaining of nuclear weapons, increasing the number of nuclear weapons, even if we don't use them. Merely the having of them seems to be deserving of a poor evaluation in terms of the morality that is in the act itself. And lastly, if we consider nuclear weapons and we say, what are the consequences of having them? We can look to the real possible accident argument. As recently, I just learned last week, as April 2022, an Indian non-nuclear missile inadvertently struck Pakistan territory. It could easily have been a nuclear weapon. It was not the intended target. So there are possible accidents, unintended consequences that we really cannot know until much later.
Time's just up.
I'm sorry.
You need to wrap up. We're just at 5 minutes.
Okay. The production or maintenance of weapons is costly. And the environmental damage just in the creation and maintenance is extremely costly. Did you say it's time?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Thank you. So I think the question that you might get from the audience is along these lines. You've made a case that it is immoral to have nuclear weapons in the abstract, but I'm worried about the safety of my family. There are countries that have nuclear weapons that are pointing them at the United States, and I think these weapons are protecting us. What would you say to that?
I don't know.
Okay, good answer. But something to think about, because that is a question I think you might well get.
I don't think we have any evidence that it's true.
I mean, I think that might be the genesis, the core of your answer. But you want to be prepared to expand on that a bit. It's a question that comes up. Kathy Malley Morrison, you're on the stack. You had a comment you wanted to make.
Yes, I would like to ask Patricia if she has ever talked to any of her students about the nuclear weapons threat. That's my first question. And number two, if she hasn't done it, will she do it now? Will she give the lecture to her philosophy and other students? Just gave to us, which I thought was very powerful.
I have used this as an issue in the past, as early as the mid-'80s in my teaching. But I have a great deal of ambivalence about it, because I think it can be very damaging to students to think about it. I mean, one of the problems is we're so good at denying the stature and the nature of the problem. And I worry a little. I remember the first time I decided to consider this as a moral issue in our class, I had many students who were actually angry with me for even thinking about it, and I understand that. But that's part of the problem.
Okay. Good discussion, and I'm glad that you are talking about this with your students, even if some of them resent that you force this thinking upon them. Let's move on to the next person on the list, which is Janice Hawkins. Janice, are you with us?
Looks like no. Don't see.
Okay, so let's move on to Jean Haskell.
Okay, thank you. This is kind of for a rather naive audience. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you about the threat of nuclear war. Along with talking about war, I'm going to suggest an action plan that all of you can take, even starting tomorrow. First, I'd like to ask you a few questions. How many of you think there might be a nuclear war in your lifetime? Just raise your hands. How many of you think there might be a nuclear war in the lifetime of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren? Anybody? I don't see too many hands. How many of you think that a nuclear war is just as likely to start by accident as by planning? I see some hands, yes. As all of you know, 77 years ago in 1945, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were leveled by American bombs that also destroyed most of the population. In those days, what we today call nuclear bombs were called atomic bombs. Today's nuclear bombs are 100 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped in 1945. They can destroy the world as we know it. To save itself, the world must save itself. I quote the International Red Cross, which said, "The prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons is indispensable to the salvation of the human race." A first step toward eliminating all nuclear weapons in the world is for the countries that possess nuclear weapons to sign and ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The treaty makes all activities involving nuclear weapons illegal in the nations that have ratified it. And that, by the way, includes things like sending small parts, like little tiny parts or large parts that may go to make a nuclear weapon. The treaty has been signed and ratified by 50 nations, none of which possess nuclear weapons. A total of 122 nations have signed, but not all have ratified. What we have to do is get all of the 9 nuclear nations to sign and ratify. For now, I urge you to contact your congresspeople, and you can call them. There's a number on the handout that I gave you. And tell your congressperson to sign on to the treaty, but more than that, to make a call for the United States of America to sign the treaty. If we took the first step in signing that treaty, that could be a beginning to having more countries sign. We must sign and ratify the treaty and begin for other nations to sign along. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, our survival depends on it. Let's decide the future of nuclear weapons before they decide ours. Thank you.
Great talk. I'll come back with a question for you in a minute, but are there comments or questions from other people about that presentation? Let me just say, I thought it was great the way at the beginning, the way you engaged with the audience by asking them questions and getting them immediately involved in it. It's a terrific way to establish their interest and get them to focus in on what you're saying.
By the way, I have to thank Lauren Peters for some of my questions. Thank you, Lauren.
I guess the question that I would think that somebody in the audience might ask is, you're calling on the United States to sign the TPNW, which I personally support, but do you think there's any way the United States would sign this if it doesn't have an agreement with the other nuclear armed states to sign too?
Frankly, that's a good question, and I'm very much afraid of that myself. But what we have to do first, we have to take the first step, and maybe some country has to take the first step. And maybe our influence can encourage other countries to take the next step. And yes, it's an almost impossible question to answer, but it's a very risky first step.
I'll step out of role here for a minute and offer a substantive comment. The Back from the Brink resolution, which many of us have been working on, specifically tries to address that by asking that the US start the negotiations now with the other 8 nuclear armed states so they can all be in compliance with the TPNW and sign it together. And that's been introduced as a resolution in Congress, HRES 1185, embracing the goals and provisions of the TPNW. And that may be a way to answer that question.
So that could be that could be what people call Congress and ask them to do, actually.
That would be one.
Yes.
Yep, that would be one of several things, perhaps.
Yes.
Let's see. I've got on stack Bernard and then Lauren.
Yes, Gene, thanks for that excellent presentation and suggestion. Taking the first step. Great people have said that. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and most recently, Dr. Helen Caldicott. I don't know if you know her, but she was a pediatrician who gave up her practice to focus on nuclear weapons. I heard her speak, and that was one of the things she said. So thank you for backing
her well.
Thank you for backing those 3 people up.
Oh, okay.
Bernard, that was you. Sorry, Lauren.
Yes. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Just one other possible answer to the question would be we need to take an intermediate step, such as the no first use pledge, which some of the nuclear powers have stated that they would be willing to do that if the others would agree to it. But as far as I know, at this point, the U.S. has not been willing to take that step.
Never. Nobody can sponsor the resolution.
Ira, what is the situation in Congress with the resolution?
Let's with which resolution? The Back from the Brink resolution. It was just introduced, by Congressman McGovern and Congressman Blumenauer, and they're in the process now of seeking co-sponsors for it.
Okay.
So, there was okay. Thank you very much, Gene. That was a great presentation. Let's see. The next person on the list is Fatima.
She's here, but she's muted. Hopefully she will unmute. So. Go ahead and unmute, Fatima. I'm afraid she may have stepped away from her computer, perhaps.
Okay, let's come back to her then. And the next person then is John Liebman.
Go ahead and unmute, John. Okay, he's coming. He's turned on his
Can you
video.
hear me? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
we can.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about being an observer in 2017 at the TPMW, the Treaty to Prohibit the Nuclear Weapons. And at the end of that wonderful conference, High Representative Nakamitsu said that the legal hurdles had been addressed in the treaty, but what remained were political issues. In the short run, those were getting the treaty ratified by 50 nations, as we've heard tonight. That's happened. I think it's up to 66 now. But what I heard also there was that the political work would continue. That frankly, that was such a transformative event that political work would continue. And so that really brings us to today, which is about a week before the start of the often delayed review conference, the 10th review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which starts at the UN in August. And I thought I would just read the key article there. Article 6 requires nuclear weapon states really to live up to their obligations to negotiate in good faith, leading to the reduction and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. The wording may be slightly different. Obviously, we know talks between the United States and Russia have been stalled for several years and now put in jeopardy, obviously, by Russia's war of aggression in the Ukraine. Nevertheless, this conference is an important opportunity for the world to gather, communicate, and hopefully make progress towards peace and away from war. And I would just say about that, that because of this war, the doctrine of deterrence and mutual assured destruction has gotten stronger again, not weaker. And in dealing, I think, with the Russian leadership, they're not going to be out-muscled, out-deterred. They're a macho group. So that's not, I think, where the answers come. The answers come, I think, more from what John Kennedy said in 1963 about peace, you know, and about, and I'll just read a little bit about that.
1 minute left, John.
Okay. So there's no simple key to peace, no grand magic formula. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. And he also went on at the end there to talk about things that he was willing, as the US president, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions. I declare that the US does not propose to conduct nuclear tests and so forth in the atmosphere. So what I would say is appropriate right now for the US, as others have said, not to deal with deterrence and fear, move away from that and deal with peace. What can we do, as others have said? One thing I think could be done other than the things that have been suggested already.
You're at time, John. So finish up.
Is simply to acknowledge in some way the value in the world of the TPNW, that this is a contribution and not a detriment. And there are many other things that could be done also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Comments, questions about John's presentation? I think the question that you might get from the audience after that presentation, John, is I'm a little bit unclear as to what it is that you want us to do here in this audience. What would you be asking us to do to take it? What action would you be asking us to take?
Well, I would ask the audience to focus on things that will end the war in Ukraine, for example. Encourage the United States to do whatever it can in a humanitarian sense and in the United Nations with other nations, not alone. It's crucial that this war come to a conclusion in an honorable way, obviously, with the Ukrainians. But, you know, I would not promote more weapon systems and so forth at this time.
Okay, thank you. Other comments about John's presentation? Okay, we have one more speaker, which is Charlene Leahy.
Thank you, Ira. On my presentation, if I can turn back the clock of doom. On the 6th and 9th day of August 1945, a new dark age began. 2 unarmed Japanese cities were each destroyed by a single weapon dropped from the sky. From the beginning of the nuclear age until this present moment, human beings throughout the world have struggled to turn back of doom. 77 years after thousands of defenseless civilians living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were vaporized by nuclear weapons, human beings on every continent continue to be haunted by the mushroom cloud. For decades, millions of activists for peace have organized, marched, and gone to jail to bring about an end to our collective nuclear nightmare. Despite a few years of substantial reductions negotiated by the leaders of the former Soviet Union and the US in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the threat of nuclear annihilation has not only continued, but has intensified. In 2022, 9 nuclear-armed nations continue to possess, deploy, and in some cases, threaten to use nuclear weapons. In the year 2007, carried on the wings of youth, a new peace group was formed. In 10 short years, the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, known as ICAN, won the Nobel Prize for Peace. 4 years later, amid an unprecedented global pandemic, 50 nations on Mother Earth made history. And on January 22nd, 2021, an internationally binding treaty calling for the prohibition of nuclear weapons was finally ratified under the auspices of the United Nations. For the first time in our lives, nuclear weapons have been declared illegal under international law. Over half a century ago, at a commencement address delivered at American University, President John F. Kennedy spoke frankly about the nuclear danger facing all of humanity. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary targets. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the 2 strongest powers are the 2 in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, humanity's greatest opportunity to achieve world peace has been tragically squandered. A new Cold War with Russia has turned into a hot war in Ukraine. The United States has placed missiles in Poland and Romania, literally on Russia's doorstep. We are living under the shadow of a hair trigger alert. If the heightened risk of nuclear war is real, the question arises, how can we turn this dire situation into front page news? If corporate-owned major media conglomerates heavily invested in the trillion-dollar weapons industry regularly censor our voices for peace, what can ordinary people do to break through the deafening silence? ICAN has laid the groundwork for a new, invigorated movement for nuclear disarmament. But in spite of their recent extraordinary accomplishment, our struggle for a peaceful future has just begun. Now is the time for a massive education campaign which tells the truth about the senseless and monumental danger we face as a species living on an increasingly fragile planet. Now is the time to build a massive global movement to finally abolish nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Our children's futures, the future of this ecosystem, and the future for generations not yet born are at stake. As misrulers blindly lead us to catastrophe, our voices for peace are desperately needed. If I can make a difference, so can each and every one of us. Less than 6 months before he was murdered, JFK eloquently and courageously spoke out to end nuclear madness. He said, "Is not peace in the last analysis basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as Mother Nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence." If humans have a chance to finally turn back the clock of doom, millions of people around the world need to step forward. If I can work to build a world of peace, then each and every one of us can do it too. Now it's up to you and me. Thank you.
Great talk and a perfect note for our last speech tonight. Really great. I guess I don't even know what the question from the audience could be. I'll try to think of one in a minute. But do people have comments about Charlene's talk that they would like to offer? Just getting lots of good talk, fantastic talks in the chat. Okay.
Ira, I'd like to offer one specific comment.
Please.
I thought the way that you began in around 1945 with the history and pulled us forward, there were references both to the past and the future the whole time. And for me, it was, I would say, the only time I've been aware during a presentation like this of it being really intergenerational, cross-generational, whatever you want to say. There was a real sense of it spanning past all the way into the future and then back, and it was very, very well done.
And a bunch of other comments to that same effect, and one person on stack, which is Bernard, and then Kathy Malley-Morrison.
Yes, Charlene, thank you for bringing that that comment about what happened in the United Nations making nuclear weapons illegal. I think that's a good start. Now, if it metamorphosizes down to the superpowers and all the countries who do have nuclear weapons, maybe the United Nations will finally be able to muscle it. I shouldn't use that word muscle, but do its job. Thank you. Good presentation.
Kathy?
I'd like to ask Charlene and every one of our speakers today if they will pledge to give the talks that they've presented to us today to every possible audience they can get, to friends, to groups, to their mailmen, to the meter readers. Be prepared to give as much of your talks as you can to anybody who will listen. Offer them cookies if you have to sit still. Thank you.
Terrific comment. Thanks, Kathy. Mary Lou Sanders?
I learned a lot by listening to everyone's presentation. I appreciate the time that they put into that. I know it's not easy to be on camera and make a presentation. This last one in particular, when the question was asked, how do we bring more attention to this? Not the exact words, but like, how do we get media coverage? It may, not that we don't know already how not talked about this is, but that's an area where we do have some power, because we may not be able to get our legislators' attention, but it's a little easier to write a letter to the editor and pose the question in the letter to the editor or the editorial, whatever, that aren't the newspapers covering this when we're living, like somebody said, with guns pointed at our children's backs. Challenge the newspaper and by using their own format against them. So I appreciate that comment about bringing it more to the public light. Thank you.
So Let me just ask, first of all, because I had Miss Charlene as somebody who was prepared to speak tonight. Is there anybody else who wanted to do a presentation tonight that I didn't get on my list who would like to go ahead and do that? I see two hands up, and unfortunately, the way the screen is displayed, I can't see the names. One of them is Jean, and I can't see the other person whose
Jean
hand is up.
Haskell and Nancy Rice.
Okay, Jean,
Haskell
and then
went.
Nancy.
I want to second the comment that somebody made about writing letters to the editor. And Hiroshima Day and Nagasaki Day are coming up. They are perfect times to write to the editor and remind people 77 years ago, this is what happened, and we don't want it to happen again. Who knows if they'll publish, but we can keep bombarding them with letters.
Thanks, Jean. Nancy?
Well, I just had a letter to the editor started as a draft, and I could read that if there's time, otherwise I won't. And I had one comment to make, I think it was about Charlene's, on turning the clock back. That could be a theme for once nuclear weapons are fired, we would want to turn the clock back. And so what can we do to do that? That was a thought on hers, and mine was a letter to the editor because I can't even picture talking in an audience.
Okay. Bruce, I think you had your hand up next, and then Lauren says that he has a short talk.
Yeah, my comment and question about how to get people to talk about nuclear weapons is to consider, can we approach our Department of Motor Vehicles? Our Department of Motor Vehicles is supposed to keep us safe on the road, but I don't think we're very safe with the gun to the back of our heads with nuclear weapons, or also I do not believe that nuclear weapons makers are abiding by the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So I would wonder if people think writing to their Department of Motor Vehicles and trying to have the Department of Motor Vehicle handbook talk about safety regarding getting the world to 1.5 degrees and limiting global warming, ending our greenhouse gas emissions. And to end our greenhouse gas emissions involves nuclear weapons companies also stopping emitting their greenhouse gases. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Bruce. I saw that, I'm sorry, somebody had said that they did want to have a short talk to give. It was Lauren.
Lauren, yeah.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Thank you. Martin Hellman, Senior Fellow for Nuclear Risk Analysis, Federation of American Scientists, 3 years ago published a paper that concluded, quote, "Continuing possession of nuclear weapons makes nuclear war inevitable." He goes on to say, "A child born today in America would have roughly 1 chance in 6 of being killed by a nuclear weapon over his or her expected lifetime. The same odds as in Russian roulette." So he is estimating that the odds of nuclear war, most likely by blunder, are roughly 20% per century. In the next 3 centuries, the odds of not having a nuclear war are roughly 80% times 80% times 80%, which comes to about 50%. Individual radioactive atoms decay at random, but half-life of a collection of radioactive isotope always decays in the same time, called its half-life. Nuclear civilization apparently also decay. The half-life of ours is perhaps 3 centuries. On the other hand, a nuclear war could happen tomorrow. So I worry about my grandchildren and their grandchildren. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think because of the time, we're not going to be able to do much, but if people have comments on Lauren's talk that they want to offer real quickly, let's do that before we have to wrap up in just a minute. So let me just add a quick closing comment. I'm just kind of blown away. There have been so many really great presentations, and it's clear that there are a large group of people on this call who are ready to go out and do public speaking on this. And it's the question that was posed by Kathy before, will we go out and do that? One person did raise last week that part of the problem is finding audiences. And it is an issue sometimes, trying to get people who are willing to come and engage with us in this conversation. But I think we're prepared, many people on this call, to be part of that conversation. And I really want to encourage people to go out and give these talks and to try to drum up the audiences in your communities. And if there are ways that we can be helpful, please get back in touch with us here at Mass Peace Action so that we can help figure out how to coordinate your work or be supportive of it or take advantage of it. And with that, it is 8:30. I think we should try to be respectful of people's time and close on time. And I just, the chat will get saved. If people want to quickly save it themselves so they have access to it, why don't you do that before we close off the meeting? And again, I just want to thank everyone who participated. These are really superb presentations, and I appreciate both the quality of the work people did and also your willingness to sort of put yourself out and make a public presentation like this. So thanks everyone very much.